Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Doyle,
And I'm Jeanne Vaccaro.
and we're the co-curators of Scientia Sexualis.
We did it.
Yeah.
It's really exciting. I know it's very emotional because we began this project in 2019, and these are the final hours of the exhibition. We're really honored that you all have come through this space and are here, and we're so happy to have a kind of final set of reflections with C. Riley Snorton, who is an incredible scholar. His bio is in the pamphlet, but has been a friend and an interlocutor for many years, and for this project, really like an anchor from the beginning for the kind of thinking that developed the ideas and the artwork in the exhibition. So this is a real treat.
And Riley just got to see the show for the first time today, so we're so happy to share this show with people who were involved with the development of its concept and was part of these conversations. But also, when we're making this show, definitely have people in our mind when we think about who is this show for. So Riley, it's you, but also readers of your work and the kind of constellation of artists and scholars and writers and art workers that connect the people who are here. So it's kind of special that I think that kind of the way that history unfolded is that this event, which was supposed to start off 2025, is the concluding event of the show. So this is going to be a conversation, and we're going to talk between the three of us, with Riley taking the lead and me and Jeanne kind of jumping in, and this will turn into a three-way discussion, which will open up to you. So I also want to encourage people, if you have questions about the show, if there are things you want to know about, it's all allowed. And this is the last time that we'll have a chance to be in the room with the work and with many of the artists from the show. So let's make the most of it, right? Okay, we're gonna just jump in. Oh yeah.
Perfect. Great. Yeah. There we go. Hello. Okay. I'm just so excited to be in conversation with both of you, and I see this concluding event as an opportunity to think about a whole bunch of openings that I think that the exhibit kind of powerfully stages. And I see the conversation as like an extension of ongoing conversations, not only between us, but among so many of the folks in this room. So what I would love to do is kind of maybe have a couple of questions that are both kind of opening questions. One question about the kind of time of conceptualization and the time of the exhibition. And then another question which might also have some bearing on this too, which is about, one of the things that I find so powerfully articulated in the exhibit is this, is the kind of the fact that Scientia Sexualis is an aesthetic regime, right? So like medical scientific knowledge is an aesthetic regime, and I think that we can see this in lots of different variations. But I guess I'll turn back to the kind of first opening question, because I think there's so much about the curatorial practice and the way of languaging around it that have to do with these moments of conceptualization and now our presence here in the kind of final hours of the show. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we began this in 2019, is that right? So
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
that was the first time, the end of the first 4 years of the thing that's happening now that maybe will be 4 years or not. And this exhibition, as most of you know, is part of the Getty's PST Art and Science Collide initiative. And our kind of sense of what science like our only interest in science did have to do with like the body and science, like the many different scientific disciplines and regimes that govern the body, the sense of sex, race, gender, ability, that shape the body seemingly in response to some kind of like evidentiary claims. So there was always a kind of like porosity or permeability or and as you said, like kind of like aesthetic underpinnings of how the body has been imagined art historically. So something like, do we have Candace's?
Yeah, and just take me a
You know,
second.
the idea of like science and medicine's desire to see into the body, to know it like in a sense of the truth of what it is and could be, and then in contrast, quote unquote, contrast to our sense of lived experience and what is true and false.
Yeah, I emailed Jeanne in the summer or emailed you or phoned. I was like, I remember asking you. I remember I was with my auntie, and I remember telling her that I had this idea and that I could only do it if it was with Jeanne Vaccaro. So that was in 2019, and just in terms of like how quickly things have changed. Sorry, it's like really weirdly windy outside. How things have changed. At the time when the Getty announced its festival, Art and Science, my eyes could not have rolled harder. And it's partly because I'm a humanist. So I'm in an English department. I write about visual studies, kind of performance studies. Jeanne's in a similar disciplinary space. And one of the things that we see all the time is a turn to things like ecology and other kinds of knowledge systems, right, that are kind of anchored in a scientific claim, and it feels very much like an avoiding, specifically race and sex, and so that's a very kind of conservative thing that one might see. So, essays on what? Class also, but I'm going to say race and sex even more in the kind of formation that I'm talking about. I'm gonna stick to my guns on that, and look forward to having a cocktail and talking that out. And that's a very kind of academic phenomenon in the academy. Oh, sorry, yeah, it would be in the academy if it's academic, but and there's also it's like a couple things, like it's avoidant and it's also like chasing the money. And then like right now, what we're looking at is our colleagues in the sciences are being treated like arts-based humanists right now, right? They are actually being told that their work isn't really knowledge, and not only that the things that they're doing are really harmful and dangerous. And they're freaking the F out, as they should be, right? I don't wish the working conditions of arts-based humanists on any researcher or any scholar, but like the kind of work that we do it kind of on the back foot, and often in contexts where you're working in a hostile institutional environment, and it's so normalized, so it's so. Jeanne's at the University of Kansas, and so as I'm speaking, I'm like, the working conditions I know are infinitely better than the working conditions that she's in, and there's so many things that have changed from 2019 to now, but this is probably the one that is the most intense.
Yeah, I mean, since I arrived in LA 2 weeks ago, Kansas has banned gender-affirming care for, quote, minors under the age of 19. One of the conversations that Hill Malatino introduced in the brilliant keynote on Friday night was that age of 18 versus 19 is going to, be a lever to allow banning gender-affirming care for adults. Students have been prohibited from using their chosen names and pronouns in schools, and teachers who, respect their chosen names and pronouns are not going to be protected if they use them. So it's pretty suffocating to kind of imagine what we do together, And so it's been very meaningful to be in spaces where people are opening up these conversations for, Hill, I think, again, your talk was really useful, that where does one go? And then this came up in the panel just before with Schreiber, kind of asserting, I am this, I can be it and I am it without needing anyone to say or not. And so there's this kind of real pressure and tension around lived and needed experience, and then the authorizing forces around it. So.
Can I ask you to say a little bit more about what you said about aesthetics and Scientia Sexualis itself?
Yeah, no, so I'm also drawn, there's something in what you were saying about ecologies as a avoidant strategy for thinking about the materialities of race and sex that I think I'm also really kind of sitting with, because, you know, Scientia Sexualis in kind of Foucault's formulation comes kind of with ars erotica as the kind of site of you know, bodies and pleasures that also maps onto the kind of non-Western world. And Scientia Sexualis, I think there are so many instances across the exhibit where we can sit with, you know, from the kind of materiality of the book, and we see various ways that the DSM-4 is invoked, or DSM-3, the glass installation of books, that the very textuality of these forms of classificatory knowledge come through aesthetic objects, but also that certainly, you know, part of what you know, I was really concerned with in Black on Both Sides is that the kind of the gender sex division is also woven through and perhaps even constituted by forms of racial science and eugenics. And so as I was thinking about what the exhibit offers and the various places that you get acted upon, right? So the bathroom is another site of being acted upon, and to think about what it means to sit inside various kinds of libraries and scenes of instruction. I was really eager to maybe hear more meditation from you both about what you saw as the opportunity of thinking about Scientia Sexualis as a kind of aesthetic project, and not only not only although beautifully rendered in the hands of artists in the space, but also in the hands of the clinician, the scientist, the you know, we could continue to add on what does it mean to kind of if we take this current moment as a dismantling of scientific knowledge as truth, there's also a way of maybe some other touch points there in terms of thinking about the violent arts that often violent arts that are being proffered as a kind of scientific method and its resultants, or yeah. I mean,
She's like, did someone say violent? That's a question for Jennifer. It's been kind of one of the running kind of things between us is when we conjure each other's interests and proclivities, and I don't know, there's so many places that I want to go for that, and I guess maybe I'll go back to Candace. Right, and so people have done walkthroughs, have heard me talk about the relationship between Candace's work and as a 3D sculptural rendition of these medical illustrations by William Hunter. Even there, I'm pausing because what I want to address is really the place where you started, right, which is like race and sex and how they get peeled apart from each other. Yeah. And when you were saying that, I was just thinking about how, like, on a pedagogical level, like Riverside is like 15% white, so it's like almost the entirety of my career I've not had a white majority classroom at Riverside, except for when I taught a class that was on Title IX and sexual harassment and sexual violence on campus, and then suddenly the white women were right there with me to do that project, and it was like this thing where I realized that I just couldn't. It's like if I want to have a conversation that is not doing that work of segregating thinking, and not just black and white, but also like the way that binaries kind of multiply around each other and then drift away from each other, that I had to have a more complex framework, right, in terms of how I was teaching. And I feel like with the show, there's something about, this is something I've learned about curating, right, which is the joy, the really incredible privilege of doing this work is that we could have these works near each other that, I don't know, if we thought about them only through like disciplinary frameworks, or if we allowed those kinds of categorical, those typologies and categories of what work about HIV and AIDS looks like, or what work about gynecology looks like, or what work about misogynoir looks like, right? We wouldn't have these works vibrating alongside each other. It's not a terribly coherent way of responding to that, but
no, it is. I mean, it's making me think about someone that has brought all of us together, the work of Husain Munoz, and this idea of like associative methodologies. You know, that like there are these kind of flirtatious ways of putting things together that sometimes are about, you know, because we're teachers, so we've also approached this work of putting together an exhibition and inhabiting like physical space and like the world of ideas and of language into another realm, and just the kind of place of like proximity and parallel has allowed us to cut through what I think in the classroom often feel like really like segmented and disciplinary silos. That your work, of course, has like been really central to kind of breaking through. But there's just the associative, or the kind of just that place where space allows us to do something differently. I mean, the last panel, I was really struck by this idea of like trying to remake or reform or repair the institution, and in the context of like the, you know, therapeutic institution, but for us, the museum, you know, like we were talking earlier about, you mentioned Chris Vargas's wallpaper, there's Damian Dinayazzi's mural outside. We really had a kind of like, we always talk about the cannibal in one register, but we had a kind of, we were like, we want every inch of the museum, we want to do something with it, and ICALA was very generous in allowing us that, but I think what it means to kind of like inhabit an institution for a certain amount of time to do reparative work, because museums, of course, also are institutions of violence and disciplinary siloing. And
and maybe that's a place for us to touch down on the invocation of cannibalism that's on the wall kind of around the corner from us, and it's juxtaposed or in proximity to King Cobra's work. You know, and so at once there's like an ongoingness of a conversation about Black and Indigenous knowledges and critique, and there's also, I think there's a lot there in terms of continuing a conversation about reckoning and repair, and so I'm, you know, in terms of the practice, you know, of the other image as well with. J. Marion Sims lionized as a father of gynecology through forms of, produces certain forms of medical knowledge by way of a kind of brutal experimentation on plantation. Like the bologna itself is constituted by the dirt on his grave. And I feel like that's one way that we might approach this question of reckoning and repair. And I'm also still digesting the insights of the previous panel, where the question of repair came alongside a meditation on delusion, and so I think that that's also kind of palpable for what it would mean for us to kind of continue to think with that. But I guess I invite more conversation around what these forms of art practice and forms of proximity also invite in terms of thinking about the scale of redress that I think is another kind of ongoing question of the exhibit. One that is also, you know, kind of thinking about the scale of the mural and so many very very small order places to sit with in the exhibit as well. I realize I keep making 8 questions in my one, so just take it in whatever directions you want. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things where you use a word like repair, and there's a desire. The kind of like the quickest go-to place is that we're fixing something, right? But this is also fixing, right? This is you know, Cobra's visualization of the repair of vesicovaginal fistula, right? That's the threads in there, right? So and a number of the works in the show, I think, are actually like kind of visualizing that work of repair, you know, in like really difficult ways, right? And I'm just going to go, so I'm going to go to a very weird image, which goes back to the aesthetic regimes, because we were talking about this earlier, right? Like, because like when, like I have a sports writing practice, and I'm also like track and field is one of my events, and the 800 is my favorite event. It's the event my sister ran, and and so Caster Semenya has been a really important figure in my life, a South African runner who's been banned from the sport because her endogenous testosterone levels. Well, no, she's been banned from the sport because creepy white eugenicists run sports globally. It's the reason to protest the Olympics. Honestly, like like it's a shame that people participate in it when the spectacle of the difference between men and women can only be produced by the exclusion of a small group of women from the global south, usually Africa or India. And those doctors who were proposing their practice, like proposing, like, here's how we're going to regulate the difference between men and women. We're going to use endogenous testosterone levels in these specific sports to define who gets to count as a woman. And they used these illustrations, these images, to illustrate what testosterone does to the body. Yes, for real, right? Like, this is a group of scientists, ostensibly, who are meeting to do this. And the product of this were surgeries, non-consensual surgeries on elite women athletes, right, in which internal testes were removed from their bodies and they were not given appropriate aftercare. So they went from being world-class runners to debilitated people who were suffering from brittle bone disease, because that's what happens if you don't get aftercare testosterone regime support, as well as other things. I want people to think about the women athletes whose bones were broken by the demand that their bodies conform to some aesthetic regime of race and sex, right? Sorry, I have a lot of rage about that, and that's where my work is going to be going after this. Sorry, that's actually totally reparative, which is Geo Wyatt's, and his absolutely hilarious and weird refusal of exactly that kind of science, right? So, but like, yeah, so that is a toxic attempt to fix the body, right? So, yeah, anyway, so it's not like a neutral term. It's a layered. Sorry, I went on a lot about that. Sorry, it's a triggering.
Someone in the one of the panels, an audience member asked a question or kind of like challenged us yesterday, I think, about the risk of repair, but also the risk of reckoning. And so I think, yeah, that term repair and then care was also brought up, feels like insufficient in this time. But Geo made me think of something around what we're talking about in terms of like taking up the whole space of the institution to like unmake it or redo it. So Geo's project, which you see it right as you enter, it's like these little transmitters that are connected to a radio that are in that kind of like back corner there. You hear this like screeching and howling every once in a while. So GeoIX's project, which is called Muck Study Department, is kind of inhabiting this kind of like figure of the wacky scientist, like an Inspector Gadget kind of guy that rakes the swamp and the mud, often in these performances in the Netherlands where Geo has been working to kind of think about the idea of Black trans study in terms of a science of murky illegibility and kind of pushing against these like rational modes of scientific thought. But I want to kind of think a little about the sound and like the radio transmission and like taking, because when Geo came, because we also want to like share some of like the behind the scenes things that happened for the exhibition. So when Geo came, it was really important for him to spend time in the physical building before he could understand like where this work was meant to live, partially in relationship to other people's work. You know, we didn't want like the sound to be a soundtrack to anyone else's artwork, but he also spent a lot of time like looking up at the ceiling and thinking about the like armature of the plumbing and the lights and the tracks of the lights and where would it make sense for this transmission to be kind of like living, what little echoes and caves and pockets and tunnels and vessels could be activated through that sound kind of bouncing and rippling. And I think that is more the kind of like muddy and cloudy work of repair, you know?
I appreciate that. I also, I mean, I think this question makes me also want to ask you both about the combination of like new commissioned work and also work that was produced for and shown maybe in other contexts. And so kind of thinking about the thoughtfulness of where we hear Gio's sounds, or to think about some of the work that is installed into the walls here. I'm really curious to kind of hear you talk through a little bit of that choice making.
Yeah. So you hear Gio's work the most kind of by Carlos Mocha. Do you want to show an image of that? And and then also Colleen Smith, one of her banners, and so that felt kind of like it's a little corridor, and I am very interested in kind of like media architectures and how kind of space operates, and so we liked that zone. But another, I think, Jennifer, do you want to talk about, there were 3 works that really began like in 2019, there were like 3 artists and like some specific works that always felt like they were going to be a part of the show, that maybe the show was really conceptualized through these works, and then some that we can talk about that kind of emerged later.
Yeah, I feel like we might have slightly different 3 works, but I started with Jess Fawn. Sorry, with this, I have like one of those monster slide presentations. It's like, there we go. So I'll do this close up, a detail from Jess Fawn's work, and so this.
It was really a work that wasn't ever even included. Was the cream?
Oh Mother is a woman. Yeah, so there's a video. You can watch it on Vimeo. It's so great. It's like an ad. It's presented as an ad for a feminizing cream that's been made with the artist mother's urine, and it's just also like kind of a happy accident that work was done in a bioart lab residency. I think it was in Buffalo, and Cobra was in the same residency. And actually, Cobra appears in Cobra's basically demonstrating the cream. That was one of the works, and at that time, Fawn was doing a lot of work with feminizing creams, testosterone candles, and like the biomatter of race and sex, but like presented to you in
more sort of like a not a cosmetic exactly, but the way it was presented it was more beautiful, and you could kind of find it in a fancy shop. It's very different than I think the direction their work has taken, but that was one of the kind of anchor pieces for us. And then King Cobra for sure. And now Bustamante, actually, the kind of investigation around the speculum.
Yeah.
And that's another place where like pleasure and pain and kind of the clinical and erotic sort of come in, because now's project was several people in the exhibition are thinking about the legacy of J. Marion Sims and his experimentation on enslaved Black women. King Cobra is one of them, but also now's project is thinking about the speculum, which is still used today, and could there be a different speculum? Could there be a pleasurable speculum or a less uncomfortable one? So there are a lot of ways that project kind of, I guess that's the repair element,
Yeah.
Not just reckoning.
Yeah, sorry, I got lost in thinking about now's bloom, right? Because that actually also, like, at the time that we were, like, it was really before the Getty announced its theme, I was toying with a gynecology show, and that would be, like now's work, and I was thinking about Candace Lynn's work, and or pelvic exam show, and I would turn that over in my head, and I'd be like, how do you pitch that? Like, who wants a pelvic exam? So I couldn't, it was hard, it was a weird, and it's one of those things where it was probably like in my head an essay, and I'm like, that essay has actually already been written. There's a lot of really amazing scholarship from queer and feminist studies on the pelvic exam, and artists who are working with and against, right, the tradition of the speculum and our ideas about it. I've got Annie Sprinkle up there for us. Sorry, I forget where I was going with that, but that's kind of where it started. And then that art and science, 2 things. There's the art and science theme, but also Jeanne had done an exhibition called Bring Your Own Body. And that was absolutely mesmerizing. I think there was a collaboration between Candace Lynn and P. Staff called
Hormonal Fog.
Yeah, Hormonal Fog. So more, another range of artists, another range of work that's coming at us, like thinking about an artwork itself as having a regulatory potential, which is also happening right now as I pick up very gently the sense of Candace Lynn's smell of abortion, as that work is maybe modifying my reproductive potential. Sorry, I'm kind of getting lost in the memories of the before times. So.
Well, one of the things this make me think about is like archives, like contemporary versus contemporary work. So you asked about like things that we sort of knew about. Then there were new commissions. So Nicki Green made an incredible work called found 3 fruitful vines as a fountain.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a transing of the Jewish ritual of the mikveh, a water bath. But in terms of this like Getty call, because we're always in some way kind of responding, whether we're like artists or scholars or whoever we are, to not just institutional invitations, but like the allowances and disallowances of what, or like what funding is available to us or whatever. So there's always a question of like how much the archive would be present materially, because all of these artists are so research driven. They're thinking about these different histories that have shaped the lived experience of the body, but we didn't want people to be sort of like hovered over a vitrine of archival material documenting the violences of the past. And like even just spatially, like thinking about the arrangement of the body and like Schreber's father, like stringing the children up in their entrapments or whatever. We just thought a lot about how people would move through the space, about the sounds they would hear, the smells they would take in, laying down on Now's couch, that one could like get vertical in this space, horizontal, in this space, not stay vertical. And so, yeah, we really thought about how people would move through it and about these historical artifacts and legacies that, while invoked, could like live out. They stay in those like libraries and archives. We didn't want to like bring them into this space. And the work is very contemporary. The earliest work is by Millie Wilson from her Museum of Lesbian Dreams from 1990, and then Dottie Addy and Louise Bourgeois from 94 and 96, and everything else is pretty much like 2016 on. And I think the kind of work that artists have been able to make in the last 10 years, like also is responsive to the possibilities of embodiment and experimentation and thought that have opened up. So that's important. There's Millie Wilson.
Some details from Millie's work. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this piece I was really struck by as well, in terms of, it's a piece that at least one reading of it might be that it's visibilizing an occlusion, and yet, it makes me then want to walk around again and kind of think about what's imaged as being withheld. And so, I often, it's a everyday practice, especially since the beginning of the new year. Like, I try not to be a mouthpiece of breaking news, but I am also I am also thinking about what does it mean to image that which is being withheld alongside what is being erased, and I feel very moved and grateful for this exhibit in the time of its exhibition, even as the kind of time of conceptualization feels so long ago. I think I love the way that you were talking about this in terms of binaries that proliferate and then distance themselves from one another. One of the other binaries that I suppose I would want to see as actively being deconstructed is obviously around violence and pleasure. And so I want to maybe take that opportunity to lift that up as something to kind of sit with before opening this up to the questions and insights and collective wisdom of the space.
Maybe chest rest?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, take me a second to pull that one up.
Okay, I'm going to get to that in a second, but I want to say something about sort of visibility. We were talking earlier about what it means to kind of just amplify these conversations, what feels safe and not safe, and what kind of public spaces, and the removing of the T from the national Stonewall Monument, which already that idea that there's these monuments to Marsha P. Johnson are already so kind of
fraught.
Ick. Yeah. Fraught's a good word. Yeah. The whole thing is
better.
yeah, it really gets kind of messy, And so the question of how it is that we take up space and representation in moments where that has feels so dangerous and so complicated and also necessary not to kind of, so that's just in the zone. If people have thoughts and questions and things to share about that because I think it's a conversation we all want to be having. On the violence and pleasure, this is Sandra Ibarra's. Do you want to?
Or pain and pleasure.
Pain and pleasure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And there was an amazing conversation with Panteha, Abareshi, and P staff yesterday that kind of surfaced a lot of these questions and ideas too. But so this is one of the works from Sandra Ibarra's series called...
I thought it was Nothing Lower Than I.
Nothing
that was
Lower
the
Than I.
exhibition, yeah.
Yeah, that was the exhibition.
Yeah.
There was at Human Resources. There was an exhibition I organized with Sandra for in relationship to Bob Flanagan and Cherie Rose's papers at the One Archives. And this work, like kind of spatially, we always knew it was kind of going to be one of the first things that people encountered. Even though, so it's like a sort of deconstructed, splayed out wheelchair with like more feet than a body normally has, and that are covered with these pierced and bruised nipples and chests that represent Bob Flanagan. Sandra worked with Cherie's photographs and kind of made this incredible series, but you kind of have to contend with the size of it before you enter. It feels like a very it's a body that wants to take up space, and it asks us to kind of think about how we take up space, I think, right when you enter in.
Yeah, and then there's also like, I love the piercings, and like when Sandra talks about this work, she talks about how she had to, because like all those pads, the chests and the nipples are made out of leather, which she had to rub into shape. So there's a lot of like physical attention to the material and repetitive rubbing, to pull that nipple up out of the surface of the leather. It's like, it's so kind of fun to think with. And then she's also stepping into Cherie's position relative to Bob's body in this kind of allegorical sense, I guess, or metaphorical sense. A literary critic should be really right on point with those terms, and I'm not being that right now. So, but she's stepping into, Cherie's, Cherie worked on Bob's body, right? And that was their collaboration, the nature of their collaboration. And so she was kind of inhabiting these different positions, but especially Cherie Rose's, which is, to talk about like making something visible and also withholding and erasing, right? Because that's also, that's also kind of part of the story too, is that Bob Flanagan is often the figure we lead this conversation with, but their performance practice was a collaboration and was often one in which his body was being subjected to her action, right? So. Yeah.
And I like that version of care, which is like the care that Cherie provided to Bob, but also the care that Sandra then brings to the leather to kind of work with it and to soften it. I mean, I think care was evoked early in this conversation in that sort of way that we're all like, have a lot of fatigue with like on care and curating. There's like 1,000 of those, And so the care that happens in this show is a very different kind of care. It's always kind of in a relationship to, I think, other pains or
this was happening in the panel earlier where Perwana was referring to Toscaeus's line, this kind of idea that in the psychiatric hospital you work to cure the hospital, but like within that isn't, the given of that is that the hospital is sick. Right. So I kind of appreciate that. So yeah. Shall we?
Yeah, we do.
Shall we mix it up?
Yeah, we want to hear your thoughts, feelings, questions, queries, and like we spend a lot of time talking, and we actually prefer the listening.
Hand up back here. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, someone will bring you a mic just for the.
Who's got the microphone for the? Yeah.
Just for the recording.
Back in the Back here. Yeah. Sorry, it takes a second. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for an incredible conversation and a fantastic exhibit. This is the second time that I'm here. Jeanne, I'm actually a huge fan of your work, Riley as well. So it's a fantastic honor to get to see such beautiful culmination in space. I think especially space is a really key word for me. I'm thinking a lot about how like trans knowledges shape spaces right now and what we can make of that with like the very porous borders that we're like facing at the moment. And I think you're talking a lot about these like disciplinary boundaries and spaces. I'm curious about disciplinary publics and whether this exercise of collaborating and curating an exercise in an exhibition like this that is didactic and research-based and interdisciplinary has sort of, if it's changed your practice in a way, perhaps, because of the different publics that you're reaching than in your day-to-day, or how has this experience with different publics transformed your practice of like resistance knowledge making, basically? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's such a such a great observation. I think that the first time I had kind of developed an interest in curating because I had been, again, taught by my teacher Husain Munoz about kind of like writing about art and ideas is about writing and thinking with artists and not about artists or art, but with it. But I had never kind of worked on an exhibition or thought about being a curator until I was in a fellowship at the Kinsey Institute, which, as many people know, is like a important sexological archive that contains a lot of these histories of violence, and it's not circulating. Everybody who knows who goes to archives and libraries is really hard to get in there, and it's geographically kind of remote, and it felt especially important to aerate that material and to share it because it felt sort of like it was imprisoned there, and it contained histories not only of oppression and dominance, but of kind of resistance and liberatory pushback, even from sometimes the scientists themselves, that were contained and that needed to be shared badly, and it was kind of urgent. And so it came together really quickly, this Bring Your Own Body exhibition that I organized in, 10 years ago or something, and it really changed my practice incredibly. To work with exactly what you're saying, a public, right? So I think of, Ellen Rooney has this great essay on the classroom as a semi-private room, right? So the public and the private are not these kind of, and the space of curating and having people engage with ideas in space, and that you don't always have to be there with them, because the classroom is always a speculative project anyway. You do some stuff and usually some things happen and you're probably not present for it anyway, right? But it really comes into a new crystallization, I think, the idea that we could be in a free space, even this is a free museum, and thank you for that, ICALA, but when people come into the classroom, it's with this elitist space, this institution that's so hard to navigate, and they have to pay to be there, So there's just these things you have to brush against, I'll just say that.
I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle, which is an old kind of preoccupation of mine was the way that artists make work that lets us feel that goes to the space of being an object. So my first book was called Sex Objects, and actually there I don't really write as much. I don't hardly write at all about the kind of things that were in my mind with that title, which are a lot of the kinds of objects that Louise Bourgeois would make, where they look like sex itself almost, but you couldn't situate that thing within an apparatus of gender. At least that's how I would talk about it now. Then I don't think I would have made that, thought about that distinction as being all that useful. After Panteha's conversation yesterday, where Panteha, was insisting on talking about the body, right? And using it to talk about the body, and staying in the space of thinking about the body as a thing. And in fact, that's another word that Panteha used a lot to talk about their experience of having a body, right? Is being in a thing and being in a sick thing. And so an audience member, asked Panteha to address that, and they were very this is the space from which I'm working. And this is what it feels like and what it is, and that got me thinking about, there was an early commitment between us to really lean towards work that was it's even if there's a lot of ambivalence and contradiction in the work, it was very rooted in material. It was is presenting itself Sorry, I'm not. That's probably the sin. This is probably. It's like an object. It's being a painting on a wall, right? And it's also like this is these notorious. It was Dottie Addy playing with a notorious image of the objectification of the female body. Like, I feel like there's an invitation here to go into what you could say is one of the most conservative spaces in a curatorial sense of practice, right? In terms of just like art object with a capital A and capital O. But, like that, the thingification is itself, like as many of us, this is actually, some of the most powerful thinking around this comes out of Black study, right? Which is, the object that speaks, that thinks, that's a subject that is human, right? Like just like when all these things get condensed into the same point, right? And to have these works that are, probably some of the most, we have them right here to look at. I hardly need to get aside. Are like the banners, right? They're beautiful things. I'm thinking of my colleague, Courtney Baker, who works with the spectacularization of images of Black death, but also the question of the humane, right? That some of the names here, Riley, some of these, these names and where they come from. Like these are the names from the archives of scientific racism. I'm going to hand that to you. So yeah. So sorry, I didn't mean to just like but
no.
Yeah.
So we were talking a little bit about this earlier too, because for example, the second name Anarcha is usually accompanied by some of the names that are more known from Sims's experiments, but in fact, Anarcha finds other names, is put into proximity with other names, which also opens up a question about other temporalities, which also opens up a question about what does it mean to think proximal knowledges. But there was something too in what you were saying that really made me also sit with what is on the other side of the banner. So being on this side of the banner, on the non-named side of the banner, and what's going on in terms of all that organic material and all of that, the kind of rendering of various forms of nature that I think is also really compelling for like a kind of compelling set of juxtapositions. One that I think is also like, I guess what I've been sitting with since you made this this remark, Jen, is like that if we think about Scientia Sexualis as about various forms of a will to classify and a will to taxonomize, that there's something that's going on in terms of ecology that's about a kind of mudding it up. That's like trying to like. What does it mean to try to hold it all together, but also that there's a real ethical question that I think you pronounced in terms of not wanting that to then be an escape hatch outside of the kind of structuring knowledges of race and sex. So I think about the invitation there to kind of think name by name in terms of where they emerge in these various archives of knowledge, but also to situate it alongside the other side, which is about how these names or how these archives might sit together in a kind of ecology as well. Yeah.
Just also for like the fun art historical reference. So you'll recognize the shells on some of the banners from Botticelli's Venus. She's playing with with Venus, and then also the flowers. There are, there are flowers across the canvas, and those are also kind of recur across them. So it's like you can actually. Sorry, it's just one of those kind of fun things. But and then we have oysters being opened with a knife, and just wanted to. You're just nodding your head. Do you have a riff on oysters and knives?
No.
No, that's me. Okay, I'm just like.
There's a lot of, revenge knives and things.
Yeah.
And yesterday's conversation with Panteha and P was a lot about the kind of like potential of the cut you know, and yeah, so.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just love the opening up of and the image of that, and that kind of recurs. And there's a kind of a strange, like again, also like in the bibliography of the show, there's an alignment between Geo, one of the iterations of muck study. There's kind of staged around like all these piles of oysters, and this kind of reference to. Kind of a history in which oysters were like a staple food, and like people around the. Anyway, sorry. It's just like this kind of I don't know. There are all kinds of like archives and bibliographies that are embedded in the works. Basically, that's all I'm going to say. Sorry about that. We should take
maybe like
question.
Another kind of just quick note to that in terms of the question that was asked about like that we have so much that we. Like the artists and what we have learned from them in terms of the like citational practices to kind of not think about to kind of open up the space of what it means to like learn and who is a scholar and who we should be learning from, and to kind of put artists at the center of that, and that we were really interested in the idea of the museum as a kind of classroom, and part of what these like programs are doing is to create spaces where we have a kind of like a, you know, like a space of like open pedagogy and dialogue, which has been really important to us, and that whatever we can do to kind of instrumentalize the privileges that we have to open up spaces for amplifying, we have to do that. Yeah.
Put your hand up high so we can, the person with the mic's coming to you from behind. Yeah. Sorry.
Hi. I was kind of jumping back, kind of what you're talking about working with the artist and also Gio's work about going through the space and trying to find the way that he could interpolate in that. And also in reference to Munoz and like imagining new queer futures, were there any works that were not able to come to fruition or the artists found frustrated? And are there any that you would want to add to see at the next show that you could describe in some way?
Yes, and yes, and yes, and what should we? That's a hard one because, so we spent a lot of time, like, 4 or so years doing a lot of studio visits. There were a lot of works that like didn't make it into the exhibition for different reasons. You know, we often had this kind of like Sonny and Cher refrain that was like Jennifer was always saying, which one was it?
Where's the science?
And
That's
I said,
me.
"Where's the sex?" For a minute, I couldn't
Yeah.
remember if I was sex or
Yeah.
science. But how could I forget? So, you know, there was always that, you know, like, and we had these different works that we were like so attached to that we had to let go of. And it was really difficult because, and we had these conversations with people like Riley and the other contributors to the catalog and these convenings where we had to hash out really like what is like how dense and sticky and tangled is the relationship between sex and science. And if it's not like so gummed up, then it's out, you know? So it was
Yeah.
really difficult.
Yeah, actually, Riley, to come back to like this kind of like mixing things up, letting it get muddy. There's a lot of work that is not here that is closer to like bio art, really strong and interesting work. But in a sense, there's like that work is character. It's like the story it wants to tell is really about the. I don't know. I still kind of struggle with it, but there were a couple reasons why work like that was hard to figure in. Some is logistical, insofar as a lot of that work wants it's like a lot of space, it's kind of hard to. It's not really an object, but the scene of research and so.
Which we didn't really want to like represent. I mean, we were
Yeah.
kind of thinking a lot about questions of like representation and abstraction, and also, to this question of like not having things siloed in a disciplinary way. We also, a group exhibition is really challenging for practical reasons, and also to have, it's an opportunity for sort of like solidarity of ideas and aesthetics, and at the same time, all questions of like communal gathering, like have tensions, and we faced a lot of them in terms of how people get to be in the room together, really, and how objects get to be in the room together.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also just like there's a large. There are a lot of artists who could easily be in this show, and sometimes people come through and they name somebody, and I'm like, I know, and so there's just that there's a kind of the arbitrariness too of just like when you feel like you have things that are sitting really well together. I mean, it's not arbitrary, but like why somebody's on the other side of that has more to do, just like with a range of other works that are in the show, but I do think like there's like for me, some of the starting points and thinking about this came out of like this group of artists in Barcelona who were sort of in and around Barcelona, was encountering and like writing about like, or just like websites about like Gynapunk and these community-based seminars. I mean, you can take seminars online where you learn how to make lube out of flax seeds and or do like tests on yourself to see if you have a bacterial infection or if it's yeasty and all that, and so, but there were two artists, Clau Kinke and Paula Pin, and they were collaborating. And my sense of their history was that they were moving and kind of like moving actually really out of the space of art making. And even as both, continue to make art, but that the kind of work that they were doing was more of, the most important thing wasn't that this stuff end up in a museum and in a show. Right. The most important thing was that the practical knowledge get in the hands of the people who need it. And so the commitment to grassroots healthcare, to inclusive healthcare, meant that what they were making was it wasn't like taking the form of this like art object, right? So that's like a shadow of the show, really, as that kind of work and the commitments that are expressed from that. And so there are artists who are really important to this, like Michelle Browder, who we brought out for a talk. So Michelle Browder built a monument to the mothers of gynecology and in Montgomery, and has a public space that's educational, that's activist, that is the site, maybe even like this week, right? It's right around this time of year. She has an annual convening that's centered on Black women's healthcare. And major figures from around the country gather, as do all practitioners, and so the kind of work that she is making is made for people and to be out there in the world and used. And that work has a direct relationship to the work that's in this show.
I think it's really like a question of what, a disciplinary question about like what is art and what is public health and what is education and how these things kind of get work in different spaces, so that bioart stuff was really interesting because it, again, ties to what Hill was talking about on Friday with, like, Reed Erickson and Patty's question earlier about Preciado and Can the Monster Speak, and, like, using our own bodies as spaces of experimentation. And so, yeah, there were, like, a lot of kind of disciplinary questions about also what kind of, art that lives outside of a, like, a community because Michelle Browder has a monument to Betsy, Lucy, and Anarcha, 3 different statues. And when things live in that space versus the space of the museum, like, those are real distinctions that kind of like happen canonically.
Yeah, and they happen for like she has a kind of an origin story of basically being told by an art teacher at art school that her work was too Black, right? And then also that teacher, I think it was the same teacher, had a postcard of. It's that poster of J. Marion Sims's clinic that the pharmaceutical company made. Like,
that you write about,
yeah. And it's an image in which a Black woman is like on like kind of seated, kneeling position on an examination table, while these doctors are like talking about her. And then, if I remember right, there are other Black women like peering around a curtain, and she was like, "Who is that? What's going on?" And he basically told her to go find out. And it set her on a path that was led directly out of art school, So, even as the show leans hard towards art objects, capital A, capital O, I think as a curator and as an educator, I want people who have, so many of us have had that path. I'm putting myself in this. It's like there's a reason I didn't major in art history. That goes to class, right? That goes to that's a pretty fundamental thing. So a lot of us in our trajectories towards and around art have been shaped by these systems of like a classification, exclusion, and kind of naked elitism. And I would say that the artists in this show are very much bound together in their own individual commitments to fight and unravel that. Many of the artists in the show. If not all, really. I mean, Dottie Addy was founder of AIR Gallery, a gallery that's dedicated to women artists, and it's like of enormous art historical importance for that reason. Yeah, sorry, I'm like, yeah, I can go on and on.
Thank you. First of all, for just putting this show together. I have spent a lot of time in this exhibition, and I'm just find new things every single time I come. And when you guys, I went through a tour with you guys, and you spoke a lot about axes of how you thought about curating some of the works together. And I've been really interested and troubled and trying to think with one of the axes that you pointed out, which is right here. It's the Andrea Carlson painting next to two King Cobra pieces that also then have peace staffs, de Pollute in between. And so I'm thinking a lot about the tension between those three works and wondering if you can speak a little bit to it, because I think, Riley, it also, your work really kind of like grounds a lot of these conversations between thinking about anti-Black racial science and its relationship to contemporary questions around transness and trans medicine, and then also, of course, these gender and sex regimes of colonialism and indigeneity, and also how this is all grounded by what we confront when we first walk into the show, which is 1492, right? This mural that, when I see that, I think Sylvia Wynter, we have a new worldview, right? Trying to think about all these different incommensurate histories of racial violence and sexual violence together. So obviously there's like a million axes that you could talk about, but I'm curious if you can speak to this one in particular.
Riley, would you be interested in sharing like how you were thinking about that when you were walking through the show this morning, like that axis in the show?
Yeah, I mean, so we were talking a little bit about the Carlson painting and the cannibalism and the ways that the museum, the language around the museum as a site of cannibalization. And then I was thinking about particularly the fuck baloney image, because it is also about a certain form of fleshiness that is being constituted by a set of materials that include dirt from the grave. And I think about King Cobra's other forms of activation. I can't help but not think about that when I look at that image. But what I also really enjoy about your question is thinking about what Peace Staff's work is doing in this configuration. Because, you know, in one sense, I think one way of reading Carlson is to say, like, who is being consumed, what is being made of a consumable object. I think that, you know, like King Cobra's piece is kind of thinking of making us really think about the kind of genealogies into flesh, and also that like flesh as continuing to give ways of seeing and knowing race based on a kind of continuation of violence. What does it mean to be rendered as flesh is something that like Spiller's work has been so instrumental to my thinking, but also obviously it kind of proliferates in the field of Black studies. But there are a couple of things. So in some ways, I feel like I'm trying to address your question, and also I'm going to add some questions for y'all to address, which is about the particularity of Peace Staff's piece there, because it's something that you have to request to see. And so when I had my own experience of it, requesting to see it as more people were in the space, and then having folks not see it, you know, like see snippets of it. And certainly it's kind of thinking about forms of erased, or trans forms of transforming the body, trans knowledge is about transforming the body, that are being put under pressure and under erasure, but also the fact that it's not something that is, it's not something that's just on loop, introduces another set of questions about whether we kind of think about it as like a return to this question about imaging what's being withheld, or if we think about something in what you were saying earlier, Jennifer, about the artists who are not here, are like whose work is not being represented, but are the kind of intertextual or like interstitial. I'm curious to kind of maybe hear you both reflect a bit more about maybe that this corner as a kind of place of multiple forms of interstitiality that are going on here, and maybe this also gets to something that you were saying, Jeanne, as well, about like the invitation of solidarity, which is also a space of ongoing tension. So that's just me asking more questions, but yeah.
Thank you both for that. So I think the P Staff's Depollute, it's a 16 millimeter kind of poem and text instead of instructions, and it's a flicker, and I feel like that word flicker is really important because it and then it kind of gets to Demian Diniazi's piece that you mentioned, Rosie, that's outside, which is called Pause Since 1492. We were really insistent, this idea that the time scale of sexual science is long, that it is anchored in settler colonialism, and that it is, so often thought of as like this, European sexology, the kind of racial eugenic sciences of the Americas. We really wanted to think about the time scale of sexual sciences like gummy and distended. And then I think the temporality of the flicker brings us to this place where we're, because that is the kind of intersection of the decolonial, anti-colonial, a Black feminist and a trans-liberatory, and then also Sandra's work, kind of evoking disability. That is the kind of all the points of the ideas of the exhibition coming together, which isn't just about proximity making it okay.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? It's not just if we put them next to each other, then it's,
It's
it's
almost
not
like the opposite.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
We didn't want
Yeah.
works to be fighting each other,
Yeah.
but productive tensions.
Yeah.
But there are also these metonymic connections through cinema. For example, Andrea Carlson describes the composition of her work as film strips, and she thinks about her work there's a poetics of time, right, and a time scale within the work. You could say that the time scale within the work kind of stretches, certainly it's I can't say it stretches back to 1492. If anything, it stretches up to and surpasses and flows over it, right? That it has its own kind of time scale in it. So there are ways in which projectors and the loopers talk to each other, and they talk to, depending on what you know about the works, and there's actually cinematic references in Andrea Carlson's work, and references to this kind of pornotroping of anthropological documentary, via the reference to Mondo Cane, and which is a shockumentary film from the early 1960s. And if you think of the kind of sex ed film that you might have been shown if you were pre-video age, that there's the use of the projector within an instructional sense. These are metonymic connections that tie things together, but they don't. It's they're kind of just metonymic just means that they're next to each other. It doesn't mean that they're the same or they're even necessarily of the same genealogy. It's a kind of a formal harmony.
It makes me think about this work by Budry Lorenz called N.O. Body, that's a riff on Hirschfeld, and the case of Annie Jones, the so-called bearded lady who was essentially incarcerated by the circus and made to perform. And they make this work that happens in the lecture hall, and with that projector and that kind of flickering too, which is maybe a flickering of possibility or kind of a terroristic announcement. But something between these two questions has also made me think about with Cobra's work. So the Fuck Baloney piece was part of a series that Cobra made called White Meat, where she was explicitly interested in kind of turning away from the idea of making work that could represent something like black flesh that would be sold in the art market, right? And all of the kind of heaviness of that. And also to put whiteness on display as the spectacle. And there was a deep curatorial conversation around who has the, is from, that comes from, that exists outside of this, but around who has a right to abstraction. And that was really important in terms of because Cobra was one of the artists that was central to our thinking and she's such a prolific artist. And the decision to kind of settle on that piece, I think, was an important way of reckoning with this question of who has the right to abstraction around the question of whiteness.
Yeah. Sorry. And even thinking about what abstraction looks like, right? Because there's also I love thinking about abstraction to as a verb, and that we can use to talk about typologies and like the generation of an idea like sex and sexual difference or racial difference, right? That there's these materials that are literally like kind of abstracted in Jess Vaughn's work. And yeah, sorry, I don't know, that I was having one of those, I think very metonymically kind of like spidering along. So yeah.
Hi, thank you. To go back to the image you had on screen, thinking about the axis of King Cobra and Andrea Carlson, I also have this great view from where I'm sitting of Andrea Carlson and Dottie Oddie. And there's this great essay by Joan in the catalog thinking about like the motif of the book and how it's this reoccurring throughout the exhibit. But I'm also seeing like the motif of the grid. And I'd wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the aesthetics of the grid, especially thinking within, like mid-century sexological context as well, the intersections that are available through us to the grid, the cut of the grid, the line, the color line of the grid. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
That's so great. Thank you, Hunter. So it immediately makes me think about one of the works we didn't include, which was by Carolee Schneemann, and it was the sex inventory, right? Is that the one? There was the menstrual one, but it was, and you can find it on the internet or wherever, and it is a ledger essentially, right, of all of her, of different, not only like sex acts, like different types of them. So it's very like Foucauldian, but
yeah, this is actually, there's a whole category of art making that's around like the sexological survey. And Neil Bartlett ran a survey during the Institute of Sexology, which was an exhibition at the Wellcome, which is amazing. But Schneemann actually, after her breakup with Tenny, she basically started questioning her friends about their sexual practices and what their partners were doing or not doing, and did they come or not, and it's actually presented as a grid. So that falls out of the show for historical reasons. It's like if you're going to include that, there's like decades of amazing work that we could include. But then there was also like more recent Schneemann work, which would absolutely have fallen within our time frame, where there was it's like a grid, and it's like quotes from Guattari and Foucault and drawings, and she was often thinking about. I mean, what wasn't that woman thinking about and doing and making fundamentally like a mind-blowing work about? But yeah, sorry, there are a lot of grids in the show, and they're really important. And there's like structures, like the fawn work is a grid, right? Form begets function is also in a grid form. Sorry, I'm like, yeah, here I am. Here we can see it. There it is.
And then the one you just had, the Galoporis Kim and Young Jun Kwok, isn't a grid, but it is kind of like an arrangement or it's a geometry of, it's kind of referencing a cabinet of curiosities, and with these like ancient and contemporary sex toys, and asking us to think about like what's on display and how the museum, the politics of collecting and exhibition function. But yeah, this question of like the cut and of segmentation and the like legacy of the grid in art history. I think there were a lot of works. I thought of Schneemann and the ledger because the ledger has been really important for not only like kind of the sexological kind of the scientist, the expert who kind of like tracks and keeps the score, but also in the more kind of like counter-archival, like community, whatever that like binary is, of keeping track to keep count for ourselves so that we like exist and someone finds it later, So those kinds of like forms of counting that often happen simultaneously around capture and kind of existence are like important to the exhibition.
Yeah, it's like the concept of data, right? I mean, we're not presenting you with things that feel like data, but like claims about data, like those regulations that were articulated around Castor Semenya mobilize. It's like a narrative about the data tells us, right? But it's actually totally polluted data. It's data that's produced by a wide set of ideological assumptions that produce like very bad science. And it's like all the studies, their main study was completely dismissed as actually bad data. But it's like the argument that they make about the data of gender difference is so juicy and headline grabby that's basically, most, people are walking around thinking that the biggest threat to girls and women in sports, are women who are actually men and trans women. And actually, and it's like there's a mobilization of an idea about the data on that's completely false, and that disguises actually these entire huge systems that victimize girls and boys in sports. Actually, that has nothing to do with any of that. So, anyway, sorry. I keep going. This is my next project in sports, and I can feel it starting to sneak into my brain. So yeah.
Maybe another, I also want to acknowledge the pause since 1492 and the Sylvia Wynter. And Sylvia Wynter was on my mind a lot as well as I was moving through the exhibit. And there's something that the kind of question about the grid also brings to the fore for me too, which is, so through talking with one of my students, I was made aware of kind of redefining of HIV in terms of a kind of immunocolonial disorder. And I'm thinking a lot about that in relation also to where HIV shows up in this exhibit as well. But in terms of the kind of relationship to grid and grid making, obviously in the kind of instantiation of the New World as a set of, that develops into a certain, where colonial territories turn into various forms of state making or states, I also was thinking about what Wynter does around the plantation and the plot, and so it's kind of thinking about not in a kind of easy way, but in fact in the way that the plot becomes a place of sustenance for those who have been made captive, and where there's a kind of important set of literatures that are about establishing anarcha, and I think in some ways we might in a different way also think about what is actually being imaged in the flicker of Peace Staff's work, but this way of kind of thinking about them as the authors of a form of medical knowledge that could not be captured and yet are pertinent to an understanding of what it means to have a kind of polyvalent mode of care that's being exercised, care under duress, care as a form of concern, are at least two ways that we might think about that. And so, when I saw the name of the set of conversations as Reckoning and Repair, I was thinking about what Wynter invites us to imagine about what goes on inside of the very thing that capacitates. That isn't about a certain form of protection of violence, but that capacitates kind of ongoingness of those who grapple with violence every day. Yeah.
Hi.
We're just going to say we have about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, okay, first off, thank you so much for curating this beautiful and provocative exhibition. I think it's my favorite I've ever witnessed.
Cheers.
And it's such an honor to continue thinking with you, Dr. Snorton. I'm still struck by what you initially shared, in that you find so powerful that this exhibit, Scientia Sexualis, is an aesthetic regime as well, and understanding medical scientific knowledge as an aesthetic regime. And this is making me think of how Reese Bonner-Bradley reframes aesthetics into an aesthetic regime of racial representation, right? And how she also makes these claims explicit through her analysis of the dissimulation of Sarah Bartman's body as mediated through eugenics, and the ways in which it was mediated through aesthetics fundamentally. And I'm so grateful for your interventions, because in considering the aesthetics of sex and gender and transness, and how so much of it is indebted to and emergent from blackness and fungibility of black flesh, in your thinking and expansion of Spillers' ungendering black flesh as well, I'm also considering just the pertinence of what so many of these artists in that access. I really appreciated that question on the access and the architectural access. I really appreciate what's happening in that corner with King Cobra's work, right, and with Carlson's work as well. Because winter for me, I think, came up when witnessing King Cobra's vaginal vesico fistula piece, right? How the sculpture was placed before a mirror that essentially reflects the exhibit back onto the mirror, as well as the viewer on the mirror itself. And so just confronting it as witness was an extremely viscerally jarring experience, right? And placing that in proximity to Carlson's piece, in which whiteness is forced to confront itself and its histories of cannibalism by King Cobra's Fuck Bologna, right? From the white meat exhibit.
Yeah.
That makes explicit, what she's doing with flesh is, I think, brilliant, right? Because in the white meat exhibit, she's making explicit the abjection of white flesh, and so much of gaze and pornotroping is almost inverted through a lot of these artist interventions. And so when I'm looking at this, at the mirror and the reflections evoked here, and what mirrors do as producing an infinite loop, for me, it's also begging a question of repetition. But repetition doesn't mean sameness.
Yeah.
Right? And so I'm thinking of a recursivity, a recursion and recursivity. Some of us discussed this last night, a recursivity that becomes knotted. So thinking with Sylvia Winter's notion of knots and what mutation perhaps may do to a system. And so I'd love to, I just wanted to put that forth as everything that this exhibit and this discussion has made possible for me. And if y'all want to meditate further on these notions of a sort of knotted, mutated recursivity in the architecture and axes of this exhibition, I would love to think further.
Is it okay if I'm going to talk about Carlos Mota's work a little bit? So homoerotic historiography, right, has the repetition, has the grid, and then it also has, it's like, it's these are, these miniaturized, these figurines that are miniaturizations of sculptures, objects found across the Americas that depict, erotic connection between male figures or just sexy bodies or sexy body parts. And they're silver and gold, the materials that they're made out of them. So it's like the material of colonial fantasy, right? That desire, that like quest for the city of gold as being a core part of colonial narratives and desires. But this was part of a research project that also grows around a notorious massacre. It's a Balboa's, massacre of Cueva people who were in LGBTQ history, sort of like in the 1990s, and sort of like studies of like colonial literatures and the like. People started turning to the story because in some colonial accounts of this massacre, the people who were massacred, the indigenous people who were massacred, were described as sodomites or as engaging in bestiality. And that was kind of how I first encountered this story, was through an essay by Jonathan Goldberg called Sodomy in the New World, I think. And there's a scholar named Marcia Ochoa, has a wonderful essay you can read online that's kind of grows around this, right? And in which she writes about this as this is like dozens of people who were they're depicted in this Debray etching. I think it's like a 16th century etching. Kind of like I've got some colleagues here who work in this zone. That shows people being devoured by dogs, right? This goes to the cannibalism story and like the flesh eating and like kind of scenes of flesh eating and the consumption of flesh being really embedded in the colonial archive. And Marcia Ochoa unpacks this scene as a scene of colonial violence, it's like a reaction to a gender they didn't understand, right? Like that is just like indigenous gender was so threatening, right? And had to be contained, not just contained and controlled, but actually destroyed, right? And then recorded in the literature, destroyed again and again and again, repeatedly. And she draws a line, like, because Carlos is like asking this question of what does it mean for me as like a settler, he's from Colombia, so as like a settler, cis, gay man in Colombia, looking at these depictions of indigenous people connecting or sexually, and like it looks like homosexuality, right? It's like this homoerotic historiography is right about like this kind of practice of history of like kind of trying to create a sense of identity, connection, community that stretches across time, but it's a fantasy and a projection. And what he's not seeing in that moment, right, is this story of the relationship between colonization and the production of gender. And Ochoa makes an argument for thinking about that massacre in a continuous relationship to the violence to which trans people are subjected. And so it's a really important intervention. And, you know, Carlos is like making work out of that. It's like really difficult, you know, it's like that project is staged over kind of several years of work and takes like different forms. There's a video that you can access, I think, through his website. That's a really important companion to it. There are pieces of projects here that like had to be pulled out for one reason or another to kind of bring the objects together in relation here, but that's one of them. So anyway, sorry. Yeah.
I think it's kind of the time, but maybe just to underscore one thing you said about the kind of danger and the fear of the thing that then has to be destroyed takes us back to the beginning of this conversation and the kind of like precarity and vulnerability, especially that we're kind of like thinking about. I guess we're kind of at time. Is it okay? Okay, no. Yeah. Yeah, and what is my thought? Okay, sorry, I'm gonna look back at you, and the question was about recursivity and nodding. Yeah. Okay, so I just wanna like sit with that because it's such as kind of like thinkers and makers and in this moment of like moving through all the things that have been always happening and are kind of still happening and are gonna come at us even further, that maybe we can think about nodding as a form of like collective, like togetherness, you know, that kind of element of the nodding where we are kind of bringing each other along, you know, it feels really important. And that these kinds of like axes that sometimes feel held apart, that even across difference that we maybe like hold on, you know? So yeah, thank you for that.
Can we do our thank yous?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we have just like enormous gratitude to everyone at the ICALA, Ann Elgood, Amanda Sroka, Oscar Hisa, Alberto, the entire frontline staff, Amelia, this has been really like the privilege and like honor and joy of my professional life and to work with Jennifer. I love you. I thank you for inviting me into this project and for thinking with me, Riley, for everyone who has been a part of this process.
Yeah, and I'd want to thank Amanda. Amanda meant first Jamila James, who was here when we started, and then Amanda Sroka. Jamila and Amanda held our hands through this entire process. Jess, the registrar, you know, like there's a huge team of folks who told us how to do it, and this is not just me and Jeanne. And one of the things that's been very moving about this project is being part of such a large community of people who are taking full responsibility for the exhibition and all of its facets, and feeling that we were together in that is really special. And so, we really thank you, and I hope people enjoy the remaining
and the artists,
you know,
the artists.
Yes, of course.
This would thank you to the artists for giving us so much to think with that we will be thinking with for always. So come and go see the show and come and say hi. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.